Hello, my name is Tori Saracino, and welcome to my Fireside chat on British literature. Thank you for tuning in today on this chilly December evening. I promise you won't regret it. Today's chat will be on the themes of power and consent as represented through 14 essential areas of British literature, organized chronologically into a verbal timeline. So, kick back and relax in your favorite comfy chair with some hot cocoa and let's get started. To begin our exploration of the themes of power and consent in British literature, it's crucial to review some texts from the Old English or Anglo-Saxon period. And how could you talk about British literature without talking about Beowulf, written somewhere between 700 and 1000 AD by an unknown author? First of all, Beowulf consents to the authority of King Hrothgar when he agrees to fight Grendel to protect the Danes. For instance, in Seamus Heaney's translation on page 21, it says, "Undaunted, sitting astride his horse, the coast guard answered, 'Anyone with gumption and a sharp mind will take the measure of two things, what's said and what's done. I believe what you have told me, that you are a troop loyal to our king. So come ahead with your arms and your gear, and I will guide you.'" By following the orders of the king, Beowulf in turn gains the consent of the people for his loyalty. By doing this, they are essentially putting themselves at the mercy of Beowulf, who has vowed to protect them and slay Grendel. This exchange of consent between people of higher power such as a king, someone of slightly less power, and the people will come into play often in the text we're looking at today. Another theme that stands out in Beowulf is the power of good over evil, as Beowulf, who represents good and justice, slays Grendel, who represents evil and sin. On page 9 it says, "So times were pleasant for the people there. Grendel, a monster until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon haunting the marches, marauding round the heath and the desolate fens. He had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts." This theme, in a moral sense, will also repeat itself. Next up, still in the Anglo-Saxon period, we have the Judith poem, which is also written by an unknown author, likely around the 10th century. Right off the bat, we see the theme of consent between God and a heroic woman who seeks him out. In turn, he provides her with the courage and strength that she needs to behead the Assyrian king. I know I just said that the theme of power between people of authority like kings would show up again, but the Judith poem breaks that trend by showing a woman, not just any ordinary man, but a woman having power over a king by beheading him and saving her people. This makes this text a true outlier, but let's see if this theme appears again by the end of our chat. In the Anglo-Norman period, the late 12th century, Marie de France wrote Bisclarvet. First, Marie de France touches on consent within marriage when Bisclarvet keeps going away for days on end, and finally his wife demands to know where he's going. The author writes on page 47 of the version of Bisclarvet in verse, "This caused distress in the wife's mind. Although she knew that husbands don't have to answer to their wives, she said in the nicest way, 'My dear sweet love, can you not say where you go when you're not here? There is nothing in the world I fear more than your anger, but can you perhaps forgive me for my wifely lapse that arises from my concern for you?'" So immediately we're told that husbands have power over their wives and can just disappear without being obligated to tell them why. However, Bisclarvet's wife subverts this old norm by demanding an answer. Bisclarvet responds to this by explaining that he disappears because he is busy turning into a werewolf. She responds to this by trying to get rid of him, which also places the power in her hands. The themes of power and consent also arise between Bisclarvet and the king on page 51, where it says, "The werewolf ran up to his side, took hold of his stirrup, and kissed his shoe, which beasts in the woods don't often do. The king was impressed, and he summoned his party to see what had given him such a start. He thought it was strange and marveled aloud that the animal could be endowed with intelligence and could plead for its life. 'A beast that has such wits I will protect, and on those grounds I order that you restrain the hounds.'" This continues the theme seen in Beowulf, that someone who consents to the power and authority of the king will in turn gain respect for his loyalty. Another text we're going to look at in depth is The Wife of Bath's prologue and tale from the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, written in the late 14th century of the Middle English medieval period. This story opens with a knight who rapes a young maiden and faces uproar from the court. On page 168 of Peter Ackroyd's retelling, it says, "He would have been beheaded according to law, were it not for the fact that the queen and other ladies of the court pleaded for his life. They cried, 'Mercy, mercy,' so long and so loudly that the king eventually gave in and delegated the decision to his wife. She would decide whether the knight lived or died. Right away, Chaucer puts women in a position of power over the man, as they are able to decide his fate. However, they show him mercy and give him time to learn from what he did before he reaps the consequences. The knight searches tirelessly for the answer to what it is that women truly want, but to no avail. Finally, he comes across an older woman who promises to tell him the answer if he grants her one wish. Being desperate, the knight agrees, and although he found the answer to his question, that all women desire to have sovereignty over their husbands, page 171, he must marry the old woman and spend the rest of his life with her in return. At first, he resists his fate. However, by the end, on page 175, he relinquishes power and consent to his wife, as he says, "Dear wife, my lady in love, I put myself in your hands. Choose whichever fate most pleases you, and choose the one most honorable to both of us. I don't care which way you decide, as long as you want it." So with this, the old woman decides to become young again. Although we'll always wonder whether or not the knight got what he truly deserved, at least he gave his wife the sovereignty to decide her own fate, something that was not at all common during these times. Next, in the early 15th century, the Book of Margery Kempe was written by, you guessed it, Margery Kempe. This book explores her relationship with God, marriage, and power, and how she breaks some of these traditional norms of power and consent. First of all, she renounces sexual activity with her husband during a time period where women often didn't have a say. She also evades earthly dynamics of power and consent by submitting herself to a relationship with God. She takes initiative over her own fate and thereby undermines traditional norms of husbands having sovereignty over their wives. Our only text from the Tudor period tonight is "Whoso lists to hunt and they flee from me" by Sir Thomas Wyatt, written in the early 16th century. In the poem, the speaker pursues his unrequited love for a woman, rumored to be Anne Boleyn. He uses the conceit of hunting a deer to portray the dynamics of the relationship and how she seems impossible to catch. This reflects the culture at the time where a man will pursue a woman who doesn't give her outright consent to being with him. In fact, this lack of consent pushes the man to pursue her further, and despite the lack of consent, he still feels entitled to having her and is frustrated when he realizes that she isn't going to budge. Unlike some of the texts we've discussed thus far, the man is forcing his will upon the woman and only cares about what he wants. In 1590, The Faerie Queene was published by Edmund Spenser. The female characters are depicted as powerful figures who have the ability to cause men to sin by using seduction and manipulation. Here, the roles of power and consent are swapped. As in "Whoso lists to hunt," the man is pursuing the woman. Also, the poem's allegorical nature explores different power dynamics, as the Faerie Queene represents Queen Elizabeth I and elevates her as a woman of virtue. On the other hand, Spenser's Amoretti, published in 1595, describes his courtship and eventual marriage to Elizabeth Boyle. In Amoretti 30, he articulates his frustration that his passion for his lover only makes her colder towards him. This echoes "Whoso lists to hunt," and the idea that women are objects and their affection is a trophy to be won. Backtracking a little bit to 1592, we have the Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, written by Christopher Marlowe. Power and consent are tied closely together in this play, as Dr. Faustus allows the devil to take control over him through consenting to his own damnation. His consent is abused, however, because the devil truly just wants to manipulate Dr. Faustus to sell his soul. This exchange is also paradoxical, as Dr. Faustus receives a lot of earthly power, yet he no longer has any control over the fate of his soul. This connects to the overarching idea that people's consent is often abused, and we see this recurring theme in marriages, slavery, and government systems, and more. And by this time in the podcast, I know what you may be thinking. Tori, how could we have a British literature fireside chat and not talk about Shakespeare? Well, fret not, Shakespeare incoming. In the Elizabethan era, between the late 16th to early 17th century, Shakespeare wrote his plays A Midsummer Night's Dream and Othello. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the theme of male dominance arises as men like Theseus and Oberon assert their power over women like Hippolyta and Titania, which influences their desires. For example, Oberon uses a love potion to make people fall in and out of love with others, representing the lack of control that people had over their own affections and feelings. However, there is a subtle critique of absolute male power as Hippolyta and Hermia push back against the authority of the men. Now, let's take a look at Act 1, Scene 1 of Othello. First, we see the power dynamics between Rodrigo and Brabantio, who's a senator. Rodrigo approaches Brabantio to inform him that his daughter, Desdemona, ran off and eloped with Othello. He approaches the senator with a sort of feigned reverence as he says in line 135, "Sir, I will answer anything, but I beseech you, if it be your pleasure and most wise consent, as partly I find it is, that your fair daughter, at this odd even and dull watch of the night, transported with no worse, no better guard, but with a knave of common hire, a gondolier, to the gross clasps of a lascivious Moor, if this be known to you and your allowance, we then have done you bold and saucy wrongs. But if you know not this, my manners tell me we have your wrong rebuke. Do not believe that from the sense of all civility I thus would play and trifle with your reverence." He does this mostly to butter up Brabantio because Rodrigo himself likes Desdemona. This shows that yielding consent to someone of greater authority is not always genuine. Consent also plays a role in Othello, as Brabantio believes that he has total jurisdiction over who his daughter is allowed to marry. When he finds out that Desdemona eloped with Othello without his consent, he says in line 191, "O heaven, how got she out? O treason of the blood! Fathers, from hence trust not your daughters' minds by what you see them act. Is there not charms by which the property of youth and maidhood may be abused? Have you not read, Rodrigo, of some such thing?" So not only are women expected to surrender consent to their suitors in this time period, but they're also supposed to get the go-ahead from their fathers before they go and fall in love with someone. Desdemona's elopement with Othello pushes back against these norms. Next, in the early 17th century era of metaphysical poetry, John Donne writes his poems, The Sun Rising and The Good Morrow. In The Sun Rising, we see the speaker challenge the authority and power of nature. He questions why he must dictate his time based on the movements of the sun and claims that his love alone gives him the power to stay in bed with his lover as much as he wants. Continuing these themes of putting one's will above nature, Donne claims in The Good Morrow that love makes, quote, one little room in everywhere, and that there is no need to explore nature in order to live a fulfilling life. With his two poems, Donne takes an angle that we haven't seen before regarding power and consent as he relates it to nature and how much we depend on it. Jumping now to 1667, in the Puritan period, John Milton writes Paradise Lost. Through the story of Adam and Eve, Milton explores how much consent humans have over their own behavior and to what extent they have to yield themselves to the power of God. When they eat fruit from the tree, they challenge God's authority, yet the devil violates Eve's consent as he tempts her to sin. This raises a good question about how much consent and power we have over our own actions, and how much our actions are influenced by supernatural beings or simply our moral compass. Furthermore, The Eclipse, written by Hester Poulter in the mid-17th century, echoes John Donne's poems about nature and to what extent it governs our actions. In Eclipse, she argues that the moon and the clouds are blocking out her view of the sun's light, and she questions why it has to be that way. She also points out that those conditions are only temporary and only controls what she sees for a short time, again fighting back against nature and what it means to us as natural beings. Published in 1729 is a modest proposal by Jonathan Swift, which explores power and consent between parents and their children. As a solution for poverty and overpopulation, Swift proposes that parents sell their children as food to wealthy English landlords. This one doesn't need much explanation as it is a clear and awful violation of consent. Young children yield their consent to their parents in exchange for protection, and that is clearly being abused here. Swift also published A Beautiful Young Nymph Going to Bed in 1731, which reflects the times of rapid urbanization, economic inequality, and a growing commercial sex industry in which it was written. This satire criticizes the idealized image of feminine beauty and the decaying of morals in the 18th century. As our fireside chat nears its end, let's read Phyllis Wheatley's poem On Being Brought from Africa to America, published in 1773. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. Wheatley's poem illustrates the dynamics of power and consent between enslaved people and their enslavers during the time period. She writes in lines 1 and 2, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand," which suggests that at the time, people believed that enslaved people required the mercy and guidance of white people or their enslavers to help them reach salvation. She says in line 4, "Once I redemption neither sought nor knew," which shows the sad reality that she didn't even know that she was capable of redemption based on the cruel treatment that enslaved people and African American people received. She depicts how people viewed her culture with negative language such as scornful eye and diabolic dye. She ties her poem up by asserting that despite how they've been treated, enslaved people too are worthy to join the angelic train. Wheatley's poems show one of the most disturbing violations of consent and power, as denying someone of their salvation must be the most awful, dehumanizing abuse of another human being. This being said, the overarching thread that runs through this whole podcast is the idea that going as far back as 700 AD, people abused consent and power in a variety of ways, through marriage, through authority, through slavery, through love, through family. The list is endless. However, most of these texts challenge traditional and flawed norms of power and consent that still exist today. This highlights the importance of standing up for one's right to their own will, no matter the cost. Thank you for tuning into my fireside chat on British literature, and I hope to see you next time.